Have you ever stopped to ask yourself if you could play one of the arcade's biggest hits on your Game Boy screen? Well, you can! Words cannot suitably describe how massive Capcom Street Fighter 2 was. This arcade fighter transcended the world of quarters, ended up on home systems as the subject of a massive console arms race between Nintendo and Sega, and became a massive part of the gaming zeitgeist in the early 90s. Fighters like Ryu, Ken and Chun-Li exploded onto the screen and into our hearts, becoming popular enough to spawn sequels, spin-offs, merchandise, comics, cartoons, anime, and of course, the day the Street Fighter movie graced the cinema was the greatest day of your life.
But for me, it was Tuesday.
Thanks, Bison. So with this one game being so popular, naturally it would find its way on pretty much every system that was capable of a port, including systems that certainly weren't capable. So let's see which one of those the Game Boy falls under, shall we? So, Capcom logo, check. Street Fighter 2 logo and theme, check. Character select screen, wait a minute. So, the original World Warrior incarnation of Street Fighter 2 featured 8 playable characters, with the remaining 4 characters being unplayable bosses. Now, alarm bells are ringing here as there are 9 characters on the screen in total, with a mix of standard fighters and the bosses. Dhalsim, E Honda and Vega are all missing. Now, would it really been more difficult to add the remaining 3 characters? Meanwhile, the character portraits are very reminiscent of Super Street Fighter 2's artwork, which seems a little odd, but it certainly makes you think that this is a vastly cut down version of Super Street Fighter 2, and I mean vastly. Moving on to the game itself, and you've probably noticed something that long-time Pughoofed gaming viewers have already seen, that this game is a Super Game Boy enhanced release, adding notable features like borders around the screen that match the location you're fighting in. It's pretty neat, works well, and makes total sense, so it's great to see a developer take the time to add a simple and effective feature. There's a little use of colour for the energy bars at the top of the screen during fights, but that is pretty much it. Disappointingly, the fighters are the same colour as the background, so at times it can be pretty hard to see what's going on, especially when both fighters are the same character. Other fighting games got around this issue by making one fighter a darker shade, but no such effort was put into the logistics of how 4 coloured sprites can be visible on a detailed 4 coloured background. It's also clear that the Game Boy really doesn't do Street Fighter the justice it deserves. And what separated Capcom's fighter from its rivals like Mortal Kombat is that every character felt different. They all felt physically different in the way they moved, jumped and attacked, and it went beyond characters having different movesets. For this port, the poorly animated sprites are incredibly jerky, and as a result, every character feels just as bad to control, stripped of their individuality save for different sprites and movesets. Chun-Li no longer has her floaty jumps, and Zangief no longer feels like a slow lumbering bruiser. Everyone is pretty much alike, and it really sucks. And while it isn't Street Fighter as you know it, if you look at it like any other fighting game on the Game Boy, it's not completely terrible. It's playable, if a little janky, and most of your favourite special moves are there, including a few from the Turbo and Super revisions. Although with only 2 buttons, punch and kick, there isn't quite the depth you'd want from a game usually playable on a 6-button pad, and it further strips away the mechanics that made this game so great originally. There is of course 2-player link-up play if you have 2 Game Boys and 2 copies of the game, but for the best way to play multiplayer, all you need is a Super Game Boy and a Super Nintendo. As well as the aforementioned borders, the Super Game Boy version allows 2 players to fight each other on the same console using 2 SNES controllers. You're still limited to the 2-button control scheme, but at least you've got a bigger screen to play on. However, all this does is highlight the biggest problem with Street Fighter 2's Super Game Boy support. If you have a Super Game Boy, you have a Super Nintendo. If you have a Super Nintendo, you already have access to Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Super Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha 2. So, why bother playing this crippled version when you can play any of those fully featured editions? Super Game Boy backgrounds are a cool feature, and there is a slight allure in having the legendary arcade fighter on a handheld device. Street Fighter 2's downfall is its ambition, with jerky graphics and stripped down gameplay that fails to replicate the arcade classic. Also, all of the Super Game Boy support is redundant when you can just play any of the superior Street Fighter releases on the Super Nintendo. It's not wholly unplayable, but it just feels less like a Street Fighter game and more of just a generic fighting game. Considering this game was released in 1995 while the world was moving away from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and crowding around Street Fighter Alpha in the arcades and on the new 32-bit home consoles, you have to wonder why Capcom bothered to port one of the greatest fighters of all time to a system that clearly couldn't have handled it. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this and want more, you can click this icon to subscribe, this icon to support me financially via Patreon, or these icons to watch more videos from my channel. Why not take a few seconds to answer the question of the week in the comments, or just let me know what you thought of this video. See you next week.